in helping to mainstream libertarian ideas, I think that's Charles Koch's legacy.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Daniel Schulman. He's a senior editor at Mother Jones, and he's the author of the explosive, provocative, and absolutely must-read book, Sons of Wichita: How the Koch brothers became America's most powerful and private dynasty. Dan, thanks for talking to us. You know, the big reveal in your book, or one of many, and this is, I mean, you look at the Koch brothers, or Koch Industries, kind of rise to you know, superpower within oil and gas and a variety of other industries, as well as their political influence. But a big thing is that David and Charles Koch, and I'll point out in terms of full disclosure, David Koch sits on the board of Reason Foundation that publishes Reason TV. But you point out that they are libertarian, not conservative. Explain a little bit about what that means, and how, you know, how did that hit you when you started digging into that?
Well, I think that's sort of an interesting distinction, but because currently they really have a reputation as Republican power brokers or kingmakers. But part of this book was really looking at the roots of their political thinking and ideology. And when you trace those back, you see that, you know, Charles Koch was, you know, highly involved with the fledgling libertarian movement of the early 1960s and 70s. You know, at a time when the movement could basically fit within Murray Rothbard's, you know, apartment. And what's interesting is that these guys are considered conservatives, but they're really not social conservatives in any sense of the word.
Well, talk a little bit about what are your sources for that, or how would you describe them?
I think some of their own statements. You know, Charles Koch has written about this stuff going back to the 70s, including in Libertarian Review, the magazine he owned, in the late 70s up until I think maybe 1981 or something like that. There was an issue on libertarian strategy where he wrote a really fascinating essay in which he is sort of railing against the businessmen of his time for hypocrisy, essentially.
And that's because they would look for, you know, they would say, oh, well, we're in favor of free enterprise, but they don't want to extend that to social arenas.
Exactly. They would rail against welfare for the poor, but at the same time, they would be seeking corporate welfare. They would be partnering with government in order to create regulations that would keep other companies out.
Well, you know, in the book, I mean, you point out that these guys, you know, David and Charles Koch, are the principals at Koch Industries. They are against all forms of subsidy. They're really not, you know, they're not saying, oh, except for my business. How does that change the calculus of, you know, how you think they should be perceived by, you know, the left, by the right, by Americans in general?
Well, I think the one misconception that people have about these guys is that they are merely out there to line their pockets. And I think if you look at their beliefs in sort of a consistent framework, you have to start to see these guys outside the political villain, robber baron caricature.
Right. And I mean, just, you know, I agree with virtually all of what they talk about. There's obviously disagreements, but that they're not opportunistic in any way, shape, or form.
No, yeah. But the one thing that I have an op-ed in the Washington Post this weekend, which kind of discusses some of the areas where there are misconceptions about their politics, including on social issues. Obviously, they're anti-war, they're pro-civil liberties, but then again, you don't really see them putting their money where their mouths are so much on these issues. Right. And I kind of wondered if they were to do so, if that would A, change their political image, and B, if that would influence the Republican Party in certain ways.
And this is interesting because in the book, you know, again, the Kochs, you know, when they're invoked as this kind of grand abstraction, you know, the Rasputins of the right or whatever, you actually quote a number of Koch people in the book who say, hey, you know what, the GOP doesn't trust us. They're uncomfortable with us. You know, is that because they are actually consistent in saying we want small government and we don't want government picking winners and losers, and the social issues?
In the narrow subset of issues in which the Republicans and the Koch brothers agree, I mean, we're largely talking about economic ones. An interesting episode was that the Koch's political advisors sort of cringed at was David Koch at the Republican National Convention in Tampa in 2012 tells a reporter that he's pro-gay marriage. And this is sort of highlighted. This is at the time when the Republicans were enshrining a plank in their platform calling for a federal constitutional ban on gay marriage. So this was sort of highlighting one of the areas where they're out of sync with the Republican Party, and I think the Koch's people were trying to keep things sort of simpatico.
Here's a question. I mean, you write for a lefty progressive magazine, Mother Jones. How do you think if the Kochs came out and said, yeah, you know what, on social issues, we don't think the government should be involved, would that work? Would that help them with the left, or would that not be meaningful?
I do think, I mean, at this point, it's hard to say because they've become such political caricatures. People on the left, sometimes instinctually hate them. In fact, I had people, after my book came out, sort of lambasting me for treating them as, quote, too human. So it's unclear if things have kind of gotten too far for people on the left to actually see that there's places of mutual agreement with the Kochs.
How here's a question. One of the things that the Koch brothers have been doing, or Charles Koch in particular, has been hosting seminars where he brings in wealthy people and they create, and they raise money to push GOP candidates or GOP issues. And I guess it's not specifically GOP. It's that tends to be the party that has candidates that people want to do. How effective do you think have they been in these efforts to kind of push a GOP ascendancy?
I think in 2012 the results were essentially a colossal failure, and they seem to be painfully aware of this.
And by you're
the Kochs and their political operation. They had a lot of high-profile donors, including Foster Friess, who I should add is a social conservative, so isn't completely in alignment with Charles and David Koch, who were quite turned off by both sort of accountability issues about how the money was spent, and also about, of course, the outcome. The one thing that's interesting,
because going into the election, all the signs pointed to an incredibly vulnerable Obama presidency. I mean, he's running for a second term with terrible approval ratings, terrible economy, botched up foreign policy, and yet the Republicans couldn't deliver a winning candidate.
And the interesting thing is if you talk to people on the conservative side about the Koch's political effort, the one thing they'll point out is that while within Koch Industries they have this rigid market-based management system where they relentlessly measure anything, they didn't really see that same thing taking place within the political operation. The one thing the Koch brothers do is that they really learn from their mistakes. So what you see right now is kind of the overhaul of their political operation. I think 2014 is going to be when it's a make or break sort of situation. I think you'll see huge changes happen if the Republicans don't take back the Senate, for instance.
What about in libertarian ideas? How would you say, and we're looking at something that's basically 50 years now. Charles Koch has been affiliated with a lot of groups, including the Institute for Humane Studies, which started in the early 60s. That kind of push libertarian ideas and try and create a libertarian infrastructure. How would you measure their success in that effort?
I think they've been remarkably successful in that. In helping to mainstream libertarian ideas, I think that's Charles Koch's legacy. He spent more than 50 years basically trying to create and help to fund the intellectual infrastructure for this, whether it's Institute for Humane Studies, something like the Mercatus Center, or just one of the hundreds of universities and academics that he has funded. I think he's been hugely influential.
Is that, this is something which it seems like on either side of, or any point on the political spectrum, people will say, oh, well, that's bad, because if you fund somebody like, Friedrich Hayek, or publishing Friedrich Hayek, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, work, then you're buying his brain power. Somebody like Randy Barnett, the Georgetown law professor, who's a titan of libertarian thought, who's gotten funding from a wide variety of people. Is that just cant? When people on the right hate it when George Soros does it, and people on do we have to get past that?
I think so. Because obviously, you got some. It helped, but it was literature. That's what you studied, right? So I personally don't see any problem with the Kochs using and Charles Koch using his money to fund academic institutions. I know that there's been quite a bit of controversy about this at places like Florida State and elsewhere. But that to me is like there's a separate issue. There was an issue about how the level of control that they were seeking over this money and the sort of vetting of professors and things like that. But in terms of just funding fellowships and that sort of thing, it's given a lot of people opportunities in higher education.
Do you think that we're entering a phase now where there seems to be a kind of revitalized progressive left, not liberals, but further out on the left and kind of punchier and more pugilistic, I guess, and forward-looking, as well as on the right? It seems like on the broadly construed right, all of the energy is coming from libertarian people. It's not coming from the Mike Huckabees of the world or the Rick Santorums. Do you think this, the stage is being set for the next kind of battle of ideas between the libertarian right and the progressive left? And if so, can you handicap that?
That's a very interesting question, and I think you could start to see that happening. Absolutely, in the U.S. Congress, you see the rise of folks like Rand Paul, who obviously very staunchly libertarian guy, though he's under the Republican Party banner. I'm not sure if I could handicap how things are going to shake out in this sort of long-running war.
Well, who wins if the future is a fight between, say, Elizabeth Warren and Rand Paul? Who are you rooting for, and who do you think will win?
Oh, goodness.
Which are separate questions.
Wow. Elizabeth Warren, hugely popular on the left right now. Great sort of populist figure. Rand Paul, another guy who's been energizing the right over a sort of a range of issues, and also has gotten kudos from folks on the left for his stands against kind of drones and his pro-civil liberties, kind of NSA reform. I'm not sure I can say who wins it.
It'll be a better world, I hope, if that's who's making the arguments. Final question: how did you? And I read in a interesting kind of online chat you did with Gawker. You said that the thing that you looked for most in a book topic was, are people interesting? Talk a little bit about how you came into this project and whether or not how did your worldview kind of change from going into it and coming out of it?
In the 2010 and 2011 timeframe, of course, the Kochs are starting to get demonized. And the first thing I realized is, as I just looked into them a little bit, is, of course, there are 4 Koch brothers, not 2. Right. You only hear about Charles and David Koch. Those are the Koch brothers. And what interested me honestly more than their political story, was their family story. There's a long-running family drama that took place. I also thought it was a great business story in the tale of Koch Industries. And one thing that I think bothers Charles is the perception that he was just some trust fund kid.
Which you disabuse pretty well.
I think it's clear that he took a mid-sized Midwestern oil and cattle ranching empire and really turned it into something quite remarkable that I don't think his dad would recognize.
There is a kind of Shakespearean, this might be a little grand, but there's a Shakespearean dimension to, the father, the patriarch, Fred Koch, bequeaths a company that's, very wealthy and well off, but then there's 4 sons, so that never goes well, right? Right,
and of course, one interesting thing is that Charles finds this letter his dad writes after his death, and it says, be kind and generous to each other, and this money that you're inheriting could be a blessing or it could be a curse. And it turns out to be both, because this money is what ends up fueling this major battle between the brothers that plays
out.
It
is a, this is another reason why I think the book is, just really eminently readable and provocative, is that it's a fantastic business history of a lot of things going on in post-war America. The author is Daniel Schulman, and the book is Sons of Wichita: How the Koch brothers Became America's Most Powerful and Private Dynasty. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.